Hello, I'm Paula, and you're listening to Awake Radio. If you hadn't figured that out by now, you may have just been dropping in. We have Don Jans. He'll be my guest, and he'll be talking about Marxism and its impact on the U.S. Stay tuned. I'll be right back.
I love my grandma. You know, when I was a kid, she'd give me and my brother biscuits and sweets and loads of great stuff every time I went to see her. I'd say she was like a great big golden light of love. She always had time. She'd play with us. She'd spoil us. At Christmas, she'd give us loads of presents. And the food, amazing. She was the best person. She was just the best person in the world. She was full of love, and she was the perfect grandma I think a boy could ever have. I love my grandma very, very much.
I give you £5,000 for her.
Yeah, okay.
If you'd sell your grandmother, then come and work for Real Radio. We're looking for successful salespeople who have a strong track record in selling. You don't have to have media experience, just the ability to sell and sell well.
But Johnny, love, I don't want to go with the man.
Shh. You made me lose count now. 500, 510, 520.
Call Real Radio now on
You don't have to sell your grandma to get on Awake Radio. You could always sell her and keep the money.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Paula Mavers Show on awakeradio.co.uk. Thank you.
You're listening to awakeradio.us, awakeradio.co.uk, and shazizradio.com. Hi, I'm Paula, and this is Paula Live. Hello, and welcome to Paula Live. I have my guest, Don Jams, with me. Hello.
Hi, Paula. Nice to be with you.
It's great to have you today. You've come to talk to us about a very serious subject, and one that I'm glad that is getting out there, that you're opening up, bringing this up for everyone to hear, and that is Marxism and its impact on the United States.
It's very serious, and we've gone quite a ways down that road. And the thing that I've come to understand and realize is that the vast majority of Americans, whether they're right-wing, left-wing, middle, whatever their classification might be, do not understand what Marxism really is. They have preconceived notions, preconceived ideas that very much fit into the idea that the left wants them to have. And so this is what I'm trying to do, is to take away that myth and talk about Marxism from a no-spin zone and from a non-politically correct basis.
Wonderful. And what got you into doing this? What sparked you and made you?
That's a great, I love to talk about that also. I have always for some reason just been a history nut. Even as a small boy, I would read biographies as opposed to novels or history-based books. And throughout, as I studied American history, and then of course you go over to European history, and I just kept going east, and I became extremely fascinated with Russian history. Eastern European and Russian history, I would say, are probably the histories I really thoroughly enjoy and love to read. Problem is when you are studying Russian history, you keep hitting our 1917. There is just no way you can get around 1917 unless you go and you find out who was this Lenin, why did he do what he did, and on what basis did he do it. And so when you study Lenin, you always come back and you find out that there's this guy called Karl Marx. And I went and I started to say, who was he? What did he really teach? And the more I studied Karl Marx, the more I came to the realization that my understanding of Karl Marx, what I had been taught in high school, what I had been taught in college, was not accurate. And I started to talk to other people about this. And I found out that other people had no understanding of who Karl Marx was or what he taught. And then I went and I started to ask people, would you please define for me what you think communism is, what you think socialism is, what you think Marxism is? And I'll tell you, Paula, the answers were so varied. They just went just across a complete spectrum. And I said, why we are so easily led down this path is because Americans do not understand on which path we are being led, and they don't and they will not come to the understand the conclusion that is inevitable if we continue on this path. And that's when I said, that's when my son said, Dad, shut up and write a book. And so I did, and then I started to speak on it. And the more I speak, the more convinced I am Americans do not know, and we have to have an open and an honest discussion.
Well, please share with us the title of your book.
State.
Absolutely.
Title of my book. I wanted to
and where they can get it.
I wanted to call my book some fancy name, Fundamental Transformation of America or something, and I was told very quickly that's not, for your purposes, Don, that's not going to sell. And so my 9-year-old granddaughter at the time says, well, Papa, why don't you just call it My Grandchildren's America? And that's what I do, and I entitled it My Grandchildren's America, Will It Still Be the Land of the Free and the Home of the Brave? The book is available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes & Noble. It's also available on my website. My website is www.mygrandchildren'samerica.com. And when you go to the website, I have many articles. I try and blog virtually every day talking about the dangers of where we are headed.
Wow, thank you for sharing. Okay, we were talking about the date that you were couldn't get past in Russian history. Could you tell us the significance and why?
When you get to 1917 in Russian history, you run into that concept of Marxism. And, of course, what we find out is that Lenin probably carried his concept of Marxism beyond what Karl Marx had identified in the cruelty. Marx talked about a revolution. He talked about a despotic government. But Lenin and Trotsky really used an awful lot of the same tactics that the czars had used, and that is to go in and kill people just to prove a point. So we move beyond that, and when we come to the United States and Marxism, we have to say, what is Marxism? What is it really, and what is it doing to us? And when we look, Marxism is really a two-pronged ism. It says you have to destroy, you have to get away of all private ownership of productive property. That individuals owning factories, individuals owning land, individuals owning businesses, the capitalistic effect of an economy is what is destroying all of the equality that Marx says you have to have. And so we look and we say, what's going on in the United States today? They're trying to centralize all of the private productive property, the ownership, and they want to regulate all of business. Marx also said society has to be totally conforming and totally equal. And this is what we see going on in the United States today, is we have a society that says we all have to conform to what the government says, or you don't, or you will not be able to have your proper tax proper tax deductions under the 501c3s, and you must all have equal incomes. And this is where we're going, Paula.
I don't like that at all. It's very scary what's happening. You know, they with all their Agenda 21 and their green and stuff, they're trying to move people out of the rural areas and into small beehive and anthill groups and taking over ownership of everything. And it's getting clearer and clearer that that's what they have in mind for us.
Yeah. Well, Karl Marx said, for instance, that what we have to do, because private ownership of productive property, capitalism, you owning your own business, this is what brings about all of this so-called social injustice that we hear so much about from the White House, from people in Congress, from the press, that there's this social injustice of some kind taking place, this so-called income inequality. Marx specifically said that it's the ownership of that private productive property that has brought about all of these injustices, that has brought about this idea that you're going to have a certain class of people oppressed, the majority of the people oppressed by a very small minority. And in order to alleviate that, you have to control, regulate, own all of this productive property, the community, the state, the government, and all those words are interchangeable. So you want to have all of this owned. When we were told by Obama that you did not build that business was built through communal efforts. Obama was quoting Karl Marx.
Wow.
The idea that individuals will own businesses gives them the authority and the power, according to Marx and according to Obama, to control and regulate those individuals. And that, they say, is wrong. And it's just like in our Occupy movement. When the Occupy movement came out, and all of those Marxist progressives adhered to and followed what the Occupy movement was saying, we have to go back and we have to remember, what were they really saying, despite destroying the property and so forth? What they were saying is that we deserve to share in the prosperity of other people who have worked. We deserve to share in that prosperity simply because we exist. It has nothing to do what we do with what we're going to do. We deserve because we exist. And they went on to say that what our society has to become is a society where we can go out and we can do whatever makes us happy. Not what's going to provide for us, but what makes us happy, so that we can be happy, fulfilled individuals, and the society owes us a living. Marx said that all of the proceeds of labor, or the gross national product, has to be centralized, and then it has to be shared fairly with everybody, whether they are working or not. And now we have food stamps, we have extended unemployment, we have all of those elements.
Okay, I just lost my call. I'll be right back. Hello, we're back. We dropped a call. Oops, got my volume up a little too loud. How's that, guys? We are back with Don. That was not a good place to lose you, Don.
No. No, we'll go back and we'll recover. Tell me where you lost me.
Right in the middle of talking about the ownership of land and businesses is not a good thing, and that people need to be free. And make crazy
Here,
changes.
what the essence of Marxism is, the very essence, is two primary principles. The first principle, Paula, is that all ownership of private ownership of productive property, people owning land, people owning factories, individuals, capitalists owning their own businesses, all of this private ownership of this property is bad, according to the Marxists. It's bad because it allows these few people, according to Karl Marx, he calls them oppressors, to oppress the vast majority of the population or the workers. And so Marx says what we have to do in order to solve that problem is we have to put all of this ownership of this productive property, property that's going to generate revenues, we have to put all of that property under a community ownership, or the government has to control it, regulate it, or own it. So you cannot have you or myself owning a business. You cannot have you or myself owning a building and renting that building. That's bad according to Marx, according to the regime we currently have. What they say is you have to take and you have to control that, and then all of the revenues that are generated through this productive aspect, through labor and so forth, you have to take all of that revenue and you centralize it. That revenue, in essence, is the gross national product. You take all of that and you centralize that in the government, and then according to Karl Marx and according to Marxist Obama, Jarrett, and Axelrod and Podesta, you now have to share all of that revenue on a fair basis. And the fair basis is based not on effort, not on production, but on needs of the people. And therefore you have that concept from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. And that's where it comes from. So you have food stamps, you have long-term unemployment, you have all of those types of sharing of revenues based on need as opposed to based on effort and production. And this is where we're going.
Some very scary things. It's just there are people that have owned their businesses for generations and their properties, and to lose almost an identity, to think that, okay, now no one gets to own anything, it all belongs to the government, and each person gets the same amount. Because, I can't see anywhere that Marxism has been implemented that there still wasn't the top guys getting rich, and everybody ending up just being slaves and fed, what someone else thinks they should have.
When we look at history, and I always say, if you want to understand where we're going or what's taking place or what's going to happen, history is easily the best predictor of the future we'll ever have. And where we go and we find out that this concept, this egalitarianism, where we're all supposed to be relatively equal, where the so-called, and I'm not sure what income inequality is. I just don't understand that concept. When income is being, when you have income based on production and what you do and your productivity to society. But we have this concept that because I exist, I deserve. And wherever we've had that concept implemented, we've seen a vast, very quick decrease in production. We go back to when Lenin and Trotsky first took control of the Russian government. Trotsky said, Vladimir, you cannot take all of the property of the farmers and take their crops and then give it back to them, because in fact the people won't produce. And Lenin said, oh, you're wrong, Trotsky. This is the way Marx said to do it. So you see, I'm going to do it, and I'll prove you wrong. So Lenin went in, and he said, all of the property, all the farmland is now the government's. And what you farmers are going to do is, because you wish to produce for the government, you are going to go out and you are going to work very, very, very hard. And when you have your crops all harvested, we're going to come and we're going to take those crops, and then we'll spread those crops as we believe is fair. What immediately happened, Paula, is production just dropped virtually in half. And
I could see
Lenin,
where that would happen.
It virtually dropped in half. And Lenin came back and he said, wow, maybe I made a mistake. And he hated to admit that he possibly had made a mistake, especially when he had to admit that perhaps Trotsky was right. And so he came back and he said, here's what we're going to do, farmers. Property is still ours. You're going to farm it. But what you're going to do is you get to keep half of what you produce. And we will take the other half. And lo and behold, production just doubled, just almost overnight. And this is what you see happening in almost all societies that take on this concept of Marxism and this concept that, no, I deserve simply because I exist. The same concept that the Occupy movement put forth here in the United States, the same concept that Obama, Pelosi, and all of the rest said, we agree with you, Occupy movement, this is the way to go. If we go and we take a look at what's happening in Venezuela today, we find that when Chavez said, we're going to change this government and we're going to make it a government for the people. In other words, people are going to receive just because they exist, and we're going to take over all of the properties, the land ownership, the business ownership of many of the different businesses. Today in Venezuela, you have very, 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 very high crime rates. You have people standing in line for basic needs. The malls are virtually closed because nobody has any products to bring into the malls. And you have a society that is in total chaos. And this is what always happens. And then the government comes in and they use martial law to try and bring law and order, and you end up with a totalitarian state that Marx said was inevitable, and that we are now the same path down which the United States is going.
Absolutely, and it's so scary. You know, I think of Cuba, and going back to what you were saying, you know, at first we own everything, and production dropped all the money of your crops, and then changing to, okay, you get half of the crops, we still own your property, but you get half of what the crops sell for. That just, to me, seems like you first you have to take everything away, and then they're, you know, grasping at any little crumb could increase that. Okay, now we're actually going to get something for our work, so... What you're describing has happened in front of everyone's eyes right there.
And the end is always the same, Paula. And so you come back and you say, why do people allow this type of a thing to happen in their countries, in their societies? And it's always been a marvel. Why would we, who had such great and wonderful freedoms, why would we, who had such a marvelous economy built on this American capitalism concept, the innovators in the world, why would we now resort to these types or to this type of thinking? Why do people do this? And we go back and we say, well, let's look at what history has said. Thomas Jefferson told us. He said freedom is lost gradually by an uninterested, by an uninformed, and by an uninvolved people. And when we look at who America has become in so many areas, so many of the people just do not take an interest in what's really going on. They concentrate on their own lives, and they do not become involved. Consequently, we're losing our freedom. And we have to, as a society, you and I, Paula, have a real unique, we have a real unique charge in that it's you and I that have to go and we have to interest the American people. We have to inform them so that the American people will become involved, and we will go back and we will say, no, we want a free country. Once again, we are not a free country at this point in time.
Absolutely not. And they are coming at us with this plan as a pig in lipstick. They're dressing it up and making it look like it's a solution for everything, and that's where we got to point out these individual attacks on us. That's what I would call it. It's like a sweet bedtime story that covers up the gruesome facts.
Yes. Don't ever forget that every dictator, every totalitarian state that, or everybody who created a totalitarian state from a free society, always did it because they were the friend of the people they claimed. We are going to come in and we are going to make things so much better for the people. It's always the people that we are going to assist. But they always come in and they always explain, we have to go through this difficult time before we get to the utopia. And unfortunately, there are some people that will buy that because it's easy for them. They will buy it because they figure, oh, this is just an easy way to have a wonderful utopian life someday. It never works that way. It never, ever works that way. The Founding Fathers set up a government that said, you the people, you are the rulers, and those in government are your servants. And when we will give up our right to be the ruler and we assume the responsibility of the servant, there will be people like Obama, like Jarrett, like Axelrod, like Podesta that will say, great, we will assume that role of ruler so that we can put upon you this total concept of where everybody's equal, where everybody conforms, and we'll have this wonderful utopia. We are the ones who will give up that right, and it's you and I, Paula, that have to remind the American people, this is what we're doing, and that is the inevitable end.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you could come on.
I do go.
We need to be aware. Okay.
I do go and I speak. In fact, I am going to. I was down in Manatee County a couple of weeks ago in Florida, and I'm going to go down. I'm going to be in Eagleton, which is a little south of there, on May 13th.
I'm going to try to get over there.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Paula.
Will you have somebody there filming for you?
I don't have anybody there filming for me, no. But if people cannot come down there, if they're unable to come down to Eagleton on May 13th, you can search my name, Don Jans, on YouTube. And you can, there are several different recordings of me on YouTube, or you can go and you can search Patriot or Comrade on YouTube as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for letting us know that. And you guys, I do have the information. I'll be sharing it after the show in the chat line. I'm having some strange mic problems.
Well, I did not hear that. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm having really, really strange mic problems coming out. But yours seems to be fine.
Okay. I want to go into one other area, if I may.
Please do.
Okay. The going back to this concept, where and why do we go the way we are? Where and why do societies go the way they want to? We have to remember that Marx himself said that it is essential that you have total and free education. That you have total and free education, not to necessarily educate the public, but you have total and free education so that you can indoctrinate the public at a very young age. And when we look at this concept, we go back and we see what Lenin said, what Lenin did when he took over Russia. He said, "You give me a child for 4 years, and I will have that child for a lifetime." When we go and we look at what the teachers' unions in this country are doing and saying today, in open publication, these the teachers' unions leaders are saying that we must teach social justice, that we must teach Marxism in our schools, that capitalism is bad, and that Marxism is the way we must go because it is socially just. And they are teaching social justice in our schools. One of the leaders said, what I do is I take my children out into the society, and I show them all of the evils of capitalism. I bring them back and I teach them how we can correct this through Marxism to be socially just. This is what our children are learning. When we look at what Common Core is, Common Core was pretty much put together by Bill Ayers and Linda Darling Hammond, Linda Darling Hammond, of course, wrote a book on social justice, and they used the concepts that Lev Vygotsky used in Stalin's Russia. And this is the essence of Common Core, and this is what we're teaching our children. So our children are not being educated. Our children are being indoctrinated. The difference being is that if you're going to educate somebody, you say, here is the problem, you go and research it, and you come to your own conclusions. Indoctrination is where you say, this is the solution. You go and you research it so you come to this solution. And that's what our children are being taught today. And they are not being taught how to think and act for themselves. They're being taught how to conform to the dictates of Marxism. Common Core is just bringing that whole concept together.
Absolutely. The Common Core state standards is what he's talking about. We're back.
So what we have is we have a whole generation. Well, it's more than one generation. This has been going on for a while, but we have a generation or two or three or four that have been indoctrinated. And one of the things that is so key when you are in a government that the people are the rulers as opposed to the servants, is they must understand, they must know what's going on, and they must. We've been told by our founders that it is more difficult to keep a free society than it is to gain one. And I think we're learning that as a fact. When we go in and we look at what they told us, first of all, reminds me, one of the things that we have to remember is that the Marxist progressives do not believe in the Constitution. The Constitution to a Marxist progressive is the Constitution is a very, very serious threat, because the Constitution says we're going to use the rule of law, and a totalitarian state, Marxist progressives have to operate under what is called arbitrary law, where they can change the law anytime they want, where they can determine what laws they will and they will not enforce. And if this sounds familiar as to what's going on today, it should be, because this is what's happening. I can have a law passed, but then when I don't want it implemented, I'm just going to, with my pen, I'm going to extend the law. I'm going to change the law. I'm going to implement it the way I want. I know there's a law a law in the books where we're supposed to protect our borders, but I don't agree with that, so I'm not going to protect the borders because I have a pen and a phone. And so when we have that type of thinking, we no longer have a country that is under rule of law. We have a country that is under arbitrary law. Our founders told us, and if you go back and you read the Declaration of Independence, and everybody should go back and read that periodically, we find out that they talk about certain unalienable rights, rights that are given, or the rights that all people should have, do have, but these rights were given by the Creator. They were not given, they cannot be given by man or by government. Right there you have a very serious conflict with Marxism, because Marx says there's no Creator, everything is through man, and any type of a religion is strictly a religion for the convenience of the people. Marx also said it is essential that you don't have any firm principles, that all principles be abolished, all religion is abolished, and all morality is abolished, and you be a completely secularist. Thereby we can implement the dictates we want. So our founders said we have certain rights that were given by the Creator, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Included in these rights, they went on to say later on, are the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to protect ourselves, all of those things that we say we currently have. The founders said when those rights are no longer there, the people have the right to look at their government and to change it or abolish it. When we look at those rights that are supposed to be unalienable rights, Paula, things like freedom of speech, do we really have freedom of speech today? When the Internal Revenue Service can say you disagree with what the administration is saying, therefore you don't get the same tax designation that somebody who agrees with them can have? When the Internal Revenue Service will say to a conservative group, you conservative group, you spoke badly about Hillary Clinton, therefore we are going to take away your tax-exempt designation. When people in Congress, like Cummings, will say to the vote, you are trying to tell Americans that we need to run fair elections, and you're going to teach them what a fair election is? That's contrary to what we believe. Therefore, I, Elijah Cummings, minority chair, I am going to say I'm going to bring the full force of the American government against you, an individual citizen. When this happens, even though all vulgar language is protected, but when our speech on politics is no longer treated equally or protected, do we have freedom of speech? Property rights are essential in a free society. The founders knew this. This was not normal where private citizens would truly own property, because essentially the totalitarian state or the government would truly have the rights over that property. Today we have an environmental protection agency that acts as prosecutor, defense attorney, jury, and judge on what you can and cannot do on your personal property.
Absolutely. Oh, that's awful.
So are we at the point, Paula, where the American people have to say, where are we? What are we? If we do not pay attention, the inevitable result is that we will become even more of a less free country. We will truly be under totalitarian state, and we will look like Venezuela does. It's up to us to change it.
Absolutely, and finding ways to convince people that it needs to be changed.
No, it's not. Paula, and I just have a couple of minutes left, and then I'm going to have to run. But people will ask me, well, Don, what do we do? Oh, you say this is happening, and we see it. We realize it's happening. What do we do? And the answer is really, I believe, this. Number one, every citizen in America who cares about what America is becoming, every freedom-loving American must learn and understand what is this evil of Marxism. Not what have I been taught about Marxism, but they must go and they must start to read it and understand it. And I would dare say a great place to go and to get a good understanding is my book, My Grandchildren's America. I talk about Marxism in a very simple manner and explain it very simply using Marx's own words. You must understand what it is. Number two is once you understand what it is, you must discuss it. And when you discuss it, you cannot use the ism word. You can't use Marxism, socialism, or communism because people will immediately turn you off. You must talk about it in the concepts of Marxism. What does it mean? From each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. And we must discuss this with everybody. And when we're discussing it, we have to remember we're not arguing with them. We're not debating with them. All we are trying to do is plant a seed and let that seed be watered by ourselves later or by others. Because only when people come to the full realization on their own that the route we are traveling is extremely dangerous and will lead to a totalitarian state and a third-class economy. Only when they come to that conclusion through our leadership will we be able to change this fully.
Wonderfully said. Well put.
Thank you so much, Paula. I really appreciate and appreciate very, very, very much what you're doing. And this is what has to be done more and more and more, open and honest discussions.
Thank you so much for coming, and I'll be right back after this song. More coming up with Don Jans, so stay tuned. Don Jans.
My grandchildren's America. Will it still be the land of the free and the home of the brave? Karen, I want to thank you so much for asking me to come and share. It's always a privilege. It's always very, very humbling to be asked to share your thoughts and ideas with true freedom-loving Americans, and I want to thank all of you. Nonconformists, malcontents, dreamers, adventurers, those seeking to worship God as they saw fit, self-reliant people, fiercely independent people. These are the colonists. These are our founders. I'm going to tell you the same thing today that I say to every group to whom I speak. I say it on radio broadcasts, and I say it in my book. It is not my intent to try to change or try to persuade anybody's way of thinking. My only purpose is to present you with facts, present them fairly, simply, straightforward, no spin, and no political correctness. What we're going to do today over the next several minutes is we are going to look at the attitudes, the principles, and the ethics of those people we call the colonists, of those people we call our founders. Then we're going to look at the attitudes, the principles, and the ethics of a group of people that have chosen to follow the teachings, they have chosen to follow the philosophy of a 19th century Prussian philosopher. I want you to come back with me. We're going to go back to December 20th of 1606. We find on that day that there are 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Discovery, and the Godspeed. They are leaving England. Aboard are 105 passengers, all men. 104 of them will survive that voyage. This group, the largest number of them, are made up of people primarily second, third, fourth, fifth sons of some of the wealthier families in England, and they are searching. They are going to the New World to search for fortune and to search for adventure. The other group, largest group, is made up of some hardened sailors. These are men who have sailed in the navy of Queen Elizabeth I. They've sailed in the navy of King James I. They have faced many, many trials. They have faced many, many tribulations. Included in this group is one by the name of John Smith. History records him as Captain John Smith, and of course he is noted for leading these early colonists through many trials and through many tribulations. These ships arrived at the outer banks of what we now know as Virginia, late April of 1607. They sail into the bay. They sail up a river that we now call the James River. They're looking for a place where they can start a settlement. And they're looking primarily for a place that has a good defensive position. On May 13th of 1607, they find such a place. And the first permanent English colony in the New World, known as Jamestown, is started. They are led through many trials and many tribulations and secure that spot so that by October of 1608, the first English women arrived in that colony. We owe a great deal of gratitude. We owe them a huge debt, for it was there in that first settlement were two of the very principles that propelled that emerging nation to become called that shining city upon a hill. Many people call it the Great American Experiment. It was here where those two principles were started. These colonists quickly learned and understood that the way productive property are transferred in England, the way you gain ownership of productive property in England would not work here in the new colony. That idea that productive property would be passed from father to eldest son, who became a father, passed to an eldest son, or where it was passed on by royal decree, just was not practical here in the New World. So they started a system, a unique system. They said the ownership of productive property will be based on the attributes of the individual. Anybody who has the aptitude, the energy, that wants to take and own productive property, they can have that opportunity and they can build that productive property into anything they want. We now know this as unlimited opportunity, or as capitalism. That was begun in Jamestown. We move ahead to July of 1619, and we find that there is a group of these colonists, and they are meeting in a church, and they call themselves a General Assembly. The individuals that are meeting are called representatives. They're called representatives because they have been selected or they have been elected by other colonists to represent them in this General Assembly. And we have the idea of representative government. Capitalism on limited opportunity, representative government came from that first permanent English colony known as Jamestown. About the time those ships in 1606 sailed for the new land, there was another group of people in England that decided they were going to leave England, but they were going to go across the English Channel. They were going to go to Holland. Because what they learned is they were not able to worship God as they wanted to worship God in England. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, was saying, you must worship the way we tell you to worship. And they said, no, we don't want to do that. So they moved over to Holland, believing that they were going to be able to worship with less interference. That was true. They were able to worship with less interference, but they were not able to worship without interference. So we find in the late summer, early fall of 1620, 102 men, women, and children of the group known as the Separatists, later to be called the Pilgrims, they board the Mayflower. They set sail for the New World, and on November 11th of 1620, they arrive at the tip of the Cape of Cod, Cape Cod, thank you. 36 days later, they disembark the Mayflower at Plymouth, Massachusetts. And the idea that you can pray when, where, and how you want, the idea that you can read the Bible when and where you want, is established in the New World. What happens is many other people over in Europe hear about this, and they say, we want that same opportunity. We also want to be able to worship God as we see fit. And so we find Baptists, Calvinists, Quakers, Catholics, Lutherans, people from all different denominations. They sail across the Atlantic to the New World so they too can worship God as they believe they should. We find many of these people, they land in the mid-Atlantic states. When they get off their ships, they live in the same community as people from other denominations. They live side by side, they conduct business together. Many times they'll build one ship or one church. They'll build one church, and they will, all different denominations worship in that church. They will also use that church for community activities. We find many, many other people coming to the New World for all kinds of different reasons. We find people who are second, third, fourth sons of people in all different countries, and they come over here hearing about unlimited opportunity, hearing about freedom. They said, I want part of that. We find people who came over, they didn't have the money to buy their own ticket, so they sold their services. For a number of years, they were called indentured servants. So badly did they want that unlimited opportunity. So badly did they want that freedom. Then we find people who couldn't pay their debts. We find people who just would not conform to the political systems in Europe. We find people who could not conform to the societal dictates in Europe. We find people who had committed crimes against society. And the different central governments, the large governments said, we would sooner buy a ticket, one-way ticket to the New World and send them over to the New World than to house them in jails in our countries because it's less expensive. People came for all kinds of reasons. And what we find is this cacophony of people built these colonists into the crown jewel of the British Empire. And those people who were running that large central government in England looked across the sea and they said, wow, look at what those people have done. Look at the prosperity they have built. Why, do they not realize they are the subjects? We are the rulers. They owe us a part of what they have created. And they started to tax these people. Then those members of that large central government over in Europe, over in England, looked back across the Atlantic again and they said, those colonists, they're becoming too self-reliant. Those colonists, they're becoming too independent. Do they not understand? They are the subjects. They are the servants. We in the government, we are the rulers. And they started to place limitations on their political activities. They started to place limitations on their individual freedoms. And in the colonies, we started to feel some dissent. We started to feel some rebellion attitudes. And finally, those members of that strong central government in England looked over at the American colonies and they said, you know what? We are going to place a tax on their tea. Not only are we going to place a tax on their tea, but we are going to tell them from what company they can buy that tea. people in Massachusetts who were the most rebellious, said no, that's not going to happen. Sam Adams and some of his friends go aboard those ships and they throw that tea into the harbor of Boston. Those members, those people in that large central government over in England said, we don't like that. Servants, you don't treat your rulers that way. And they said, therefore, you people in Massachusetts, we're going to place on you the coercive acts. Many of us have learned those as the intolerable acts. And what did that do? It placed even greater economic limitations on those people in Massachusetts. It placed even greater limitations on their political activities. It placed even greater limitations on their individual freedoms. And the other colonists up and down the seaboard looked up at Massachusetts and they declared and they decided, we must support those people in Massachusetts, for when the people in a large central government can and will place those kind of restrictions on one colony or on one colonist, they will place those restrictions on all colonies and on all colonists eventually. We must support those people in Massachusetts. And so we see the colonists starting to unite. And then we find out that the English have decided that they are going to go out into the hills in Massachusetts. And they are going to take the ammunition, the guns they think these people have stored, and they're going to take them away from what they consider rebellious servants. We find on the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Paul Revere rode through the countryside, shouting, the British are coming, the British are coming, and the Minutemen grabbed their muskets and they ran out to confront those redcoats, the soldiers of the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Shortly thereafter, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the Revolutionary War has begun. The rest of the colonists have decided they're going to get together in their meeting down in Philadelphia. Early July 1776, these colonists decide they are going to sign a paper that they call the Declaration of Independence. And this Declaration of Independence, against all odds, declares that we will be a free and an independent people. We will no longer serve the evil large central government over in London. Large central government has no place in a free society, they say. Against all odds, 5 years later, General Cornwallis surrenders to General Washington, and they are a free and an independent people. So they put into effect what they call the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation tell us what their mindset was at the time. They were deathly afraid of big central government. They had seen the evil of a large central government. And in the Articles of Confederation, they make no allowance for a president. They make no allowance for executive agencies. They make no allowance for a federal judiciary. In fact, they don't even make an allowance for the federal government to tax them. They say, you, the central government, what you can do is you can negotiate with foreign powers. You can declare war and peace. You can mediate if we colonies have disputes. That's your power. Didn't work. They have to decide, will we become 13 independent nations, or are we going to become 13 independent governmental units under one central nation? And they decide on the latter. So they go to work and they write what they call the United States Constitution. And in this United States Constitution, we find that same fear of central government. They understand the evils of large central government. And they say, we are going to construct a government that has 3 co-equal branches of government. And we are going to give checks and balances, not to enhance the power of the central government, but to limit the power of the central government. Then in Article 1, they list a number of powers, and they say, these are your powers, central government. And even with those limitations, my friends, even with those limitations, they could not have that Constitution ratified. to go back to work. They drop what they call the Bill of Rights, or what we know as the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Every single one of those amendments, every single one of them, either limits the powers of the federal government or it enhances the power of the people. Until we get to the 10th Amendment. And when we get to that 10th Amendment, what we find is it says very specifically, if the power is not specifically given to the federal government, it is reserved for the states, it is reserved for the people. They declare, we the people, we are the rulers, you in central government, you are our servants. Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, said it's that 10th Amendment. That is the foundation of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson also said, and I want you to listen very, very, very carefully. Thomas Jefferson said, freedom is lost gradually by an uninterested, an uninformed, and an uninvolved people. We're going to change scenes now. We're going to go back to Europe. We're going to go to the year 1818. In Europe, we're going to go to the southwestern corner of Prussia. We're going to go to the Moselle Valley, to a town called Trier. We find there's a couple that lives there. He is an attorney. He has a very, very prosperous law practice, makes well above the average earnings of the people in the community. She came from a wealthy family back in Holland, and she brought a very substantial dowry to this marriage. So well is this couple doing that they go and they buy a vineyard in the Moselle Valley. We find on May 5th of 1818, Heinrich and Henrietta Marx have their second child, their first and their only son. And they name him Karl Marx. Karl Marx grows up in this town, Trier, in this well-off family. He is sent to the finest schools or the finest gymnasiums in Trier. He's a good student, but he's not a great student. He does not have an aptitude for math. Later on in life, he says, I just never understood numbers. After he graduates from high school or gymnasium, he and his dad decide that he should go up the river to Bonn, go to the University of Bonn. His dad thinks he's going there to study law. He goes there for 1 year. They decide he should now go on to Berlin University. When he gets to Berlin University, he starts to study what he really wants to study, and that's not law. He starts to become involved in philosophy. He finds that there is a group of students, a group of professors that get together, and this group gets together for the purpose of discussing and debating the teachings of a Prussian philosopher who has recently died, George F.W. Hegel. Prior to his death, Hegel happened to be a professor at Berlin University. Hegel defined freedom this way. Hegel said freedom is when the individual has the right to make a rational decision without coercion. Unfortunately, he continued that definition, and he said absolute freedom is when that rational decision is made in total accordance with the universal principles of the state. This idea of conformity, of total equality, this idea became the bedrock of the philosophy that one of those young students, Karl Marx, took away, and when he developed that theory of Marxism, his philosophy. Karl Marx said, it is the ownership of private productive property. How the ownership of private productive property has transformed over the years. It is this that has caused all the problems in society. For he explained that in very early society, all of this private productive property was under the control, the regulation, the ownership of the state, the community, or the government. You use your own terms, and all benefits thereof would come or inure to that entity. Marx said that private productive property in very early society was always under the control, the ownership, or the regulation of the state, the government, or the people. But over time, it had transformed to where that private productive property, before we go on to that, let me say, what was private productive property? What do we mean when we say private productive property? What we mean is that property that brings benefits to its owners. Could be things like land, where we own land, we rent land, we grow grapes on land, and we sell the grapes, and we receive revenue. Things like buildings, we build buildings, and we rent those buildings, and we receive the revenue. Machinery. Things like factories, we build factories, and we have those factories sell products, we receive that revenue. Marx went on to explain, this includes smaller businesses, it includes service businesses. And as Marx explained, and as we have been recently told by one of his disciples, these are businesses that you, the individuals, you did not build those businesses. As Marx explained, and as we have been told by one of his disciples very recently, these businesses are not built by individuals, they are built through the communal efforts of the community, and therefore the revenues, the benefits thereof, should inure to the benefit of the community as well. Marx said, this private productive property in early society was owned by the community, the state, or the government, and over time that ownership had transformed to the point in time where that ownership is now held by individuals. It's now held by capitalists. And it is this that has brought about more than one class in society. And when you have more than one class in society, you have conflicts. You have oppressors and you have oppressed. Marx went on to say, it is not the defining attribute to abolish property generally, but to abolish all private productive property. For it is private productive property that brings about, that causes all the conflicts in the world. It is private productive property that causes all the evils in the world. It is private productive property that causes the oppression of the many by the few. Marx said it is the aim of Marxism. It is the aim of Marxism to abolish the individuality, the independence, and the freedom of the capitalist. Said, my disciples, you must go and you must gain political supremacy. And when you gain political supremacy, you must wrest, degree by degree, the capital from the capitalist, and you must centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. When this has been accomplished, Marx said, you will have completed the fundamental transformation from capitalism to a fair and just classless society that is totally equal and is totally conforming. For now there will be only one class in society. And when we have only one class in society, well, we have a fair and just society. We have a society that operates in total unity. This is true, he said, socially, politically, and economically. And the rule of thumb economically will be from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Marx said, all proceeds of labor, or the gross domestic product, must be shared fairly with all members of society, whether they are working or not. What did he mean by this? How is this supposed to work? Marx came up with two different formulas. He has an evil formula and he has a good formula. His evil formula describes capitalism. And if you can picture this, that evil formula is M equals C equals M1. When we look at that first M, that stands for money, for capital, for investment. And that money, capital investment, is taken and it's used to build measures so that you can build commodities. You can build products. And that's the C. Investment is used to build those products. Then what you do with those products is you take them and you sell them for your original investment plus something. And this plus something is that evil profit. This plus something is that surplus value he talks about. That money that he claims the capitalist has stolen from the workers. He says it's even worse than that, because those evil capitalists will now take that profit or that surplus value, and they will go out and they will find ways to create even greater divisions of labor and even bring down more the worth of the worker. Besides that, he says they might even go out and they might even innovate and create ways to even eliminate workers. We were given an example of this during the campaign of 2012 when the Marxist Progressive candidate was going around and he looked at an automatic bank teller and he said, see that evil of capitalism? They just took the job of a worker. And that's what Marx meant with that evil, evil formula. His formula that brings us total equality and total conformity and total unity is C equals M equals C. Let's take a look at that first C over here. This C stands for commodities. It stands for that product that the worker will build. Marx explained the worker is at his greatest value. He is receiving his greatest satisfaction when there are no divisions of labor, when he takes that raw material to finished product. This is when he says the worker is at his greatest value and he is receiving his greatest satisfaction. The fewer the divisions of labor, the better. Now Marx also acknowledged, he said that due to the differences in humans, that C will vary. That C will vary as opposed to, that C will vary based on quantity and quality of the product. Those who are physically stronger might be able to produce more faster. Those who have greater manual dexterity could produce more faster. Those who have a higher aptitude, those who have greater intellect, those who have more energy, those who just have greater ambition could produce a different quantity and a different quality. That C will vary. We go to that last C on the other side of the equation and we find out that C stands for commodities the worker needs. I want you to understand, I said the commodities that workers need. I did not say the commodities workers need, want, or desire. For in this wonderful, wonderful state of being, there will be no wants or desires. We only have needs. Wants or desires are for that evil capitalistic society. And those needs are going to be defined by the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Marx acknowledged, he said, that C is going to vary as well. That C is going to vary if we have a worker who has only themselves. They're going to have fewer needs than will that worker who has themselves and a spouse. They will have fewer needs than will that worker who has themselves, a spouse, and other dependents. So we find both C's vary. The production and the needs. We come to that M in the middle. That stands for money or medium of exchange. The big question is, on what is that based? From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. What the worker receives is only based on his needs. It has no relevance whatsoever to his production. Thus we have a total, equal, and conforming society. Marx became quite excited in February of 1848. For we go into Paris, France, and we find that there's been this riot. This riot erupts into a revolution. That revolution spreads from France eastward throughout Europe. And Marx says, yes, 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 This is the revolution to bring about my fair and my just, totally equal, totally conforming society. Over the next 12 to 18 months, the militaries of those different sovereign nations had completely squelched those revolutions. Marx looks around, we look around, and we find out very little in Europe has changed. There's still a capitalistic society. There's not a fair and just so-called classless society. And Marx has to say, why? What happened? And he comes to several different conclusions. He says, it's that military. It's the military. They are the last bastion between capitalism and a fair and a just classless society. Therefore, that military has to be systematically dismantled. Not only did he say that military has to be systematically dismantled, he told them how to do it. He said, my disciples, when you gain political supremacy, what you do is you take funds that would normally fund that military and you divert them to social programs. And this will systematically dismantle that military and it will render it inconsequential. Marx also said, my disciples, you must have a vicious class warfare against that capitalist, against the bourgeoisie. In today's society, we hear that vicious class warfare from his disciples against the millionaire, against the billionaire, against the corporate jet owner, against those earning over $250,000 a year, against the business owner, against those who are not Marxists. And they employ the same tactics Marx said you must employ. They have no bearing whatsoever on truth. Truth is totally irrelevant in their class warfare. For after all, the only thing that matters is that the ends justify the means. Marx also came to the conclusion. He said, perhaps, just perhaps, my fair and just classless society will not emerge through a revolution. Instead, we're going to have policies, procedures. We're going to have actions. We're going to have a fundamental transformation from a fair and free capitalistic society to this fair and just classless society that is totally equal and totally conforming. So Marx sat down and he said, what should these policies, what should these procedures, what should these actions be? You need to know them. You need to know absolutely every one of them. They're not just the 10 in the Communist Manifesto. You need to know them because they're happening this very day. They're happening right here in these United States. Marx said, you must have a steeply progressive income tax. It's the best way to share the wealth. It also punishes those who have the audacity to strive for achievement and strive for excellence. What Marx didn't do is he didn't define what steeply progressive means. But we find in October of 1942, the Marxist progressives defining what they mean by steeply progressive. They also define what they mean by not having any regard whatsoever for the Constitution of the United States, because the Marxist progressive president at that time signs an executive order. That executive order was defeated twice that same year by Congress. And he said, you know what, I could care less about the co-equal branches of government. I could care less about checks and balances because I deem, as a Marxist progressive, this is good. And so he signs an executive order. And in that executive order, he says, I direct the secretary to bring forth regulations to tax all income over $25,000. When we look at $25,000 in 1942, it's approximately $250,000 today, maybe a little more. He says, I direct the secretary to bring forth regulations to tax, or should we say to confiscate, all income over $25,000 at 100%. Then he said, this is equal. This is fair and this is just in that same executive order. Marx said, you must have a death tax and it has to be 100%. After all, that property that would have been transferred from generation to generation, that really is the property of the state, the government, or the community. It's just being returned to its rightful owner. Besides that, he said, those who would have received it, they didn't do anything for it. They really don't deserve it. Listening to the Megyn Kelly show a little over a year ago, she had as her guest Congresswoman from Florida, Democratic Chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Question was, what should the death tax be? The answer should be 100% because that property really is the property of the government, and those who would have received it did nothing for it and don't deserve it. Marx said, the state must have a monopoly on granting credit. The way the capitalist grants credit is wrong, he said. You do not grant credit based on ability and willingness to repay. You grant credit for the purpose of sharing the wealth and for the purpose of social engineering. And he who has the power to grant the credit has the power to forgive the credit. The state must have a monopoly on granting credit. Marx said, the state must control all communications within the borders. We go back to July 5th of 2013. In one of those infamous paper drops, we find the current Marxist progressive president signed an executive order a little over 2,000 words. This executive order said, in case of national emergency, and national emergency was never defined. In case of national emergency, the state has the right to grant or grab control of all communications within the borders. Marx said, you must bankrupt the capitalist countries. They must be bankrupt. You must raise their debt as fast and as high as you can. What that will do when that bankrupts that country, it will render all of the contracts of the capitalists null and void. And when that happens, the populace will switch their allegiance, if it was there, they will switch their allegiance from them to you, and you will be able to move that fair and just classless society just that much further along the road to our day of utopia. Marx said, you can no longer allow the forces of the marketplace, competitive forces, to drive the business community. It is imperative that you centralize all activity, all economic activity under the strong central government. It all must be centralized so you have complete and total control. Today, every single day, our business community becomes a less and a less free business community. Today, every single day, we become a less free people. Today, every single day, our big central government, the antithesis of what our founders envisioned and implemented, passes more and more regulations by non-elected officials, in fact, to take more and more of our freedoms away. Today, every single day, the disciples of Marx move forward in the implementation of his demands. For today, every single day, the Marxist progressives take more and more of our freedom so they can have the dictatorship of the proletariat, implement the totalitarian state that is absolutely necessary, as Marx said, to bring about the complete fundamental transformation from the capitalistic and free society to his fair and his just classless society that is controlled and operated through the dictatorship of the proletariat. Freedom is lost gradually by an uninterested, an uninformed, and an uninvolved people. I want to move us now to the year 1840. We find that there's a young reporter that wants to write a story on why did those colonists, why did they risk everything against the most powerful nation in the world at that time? He finds an elderly gentleman who's 90 years old at the time. His name, Levi Preston. Levi Preston was one of those Minutemen who grabbed his musket and ran out to Lexington, ran out to Concord to confront those redcoats. He stayed in the army of General George Washington, and by the end of the Revolution, Levi Preston was known as Captain Levi Preston. Young reporter goes out, his questions in tow. First question to Captain Preston is, Captain Preston, was it the oppression of the evil British government that you felt that drove you to this revolution? Captain Preston thinks hard and says, No, I didn't feel any oppression. I don't know of any of my friends that felt oppression. Young reporter goes on to his next question and says, well then, Captain Preston, would it have been your reading of the Enlightenment authors, Rousseau and Voltaire, that it told you you should be a free and independent people? Now, Captain Preston smiles, looks at the young reporter and says, son, we didn't have time to read people like that. Why, when we had time to read, we would read the Bible. No, it wasn't anything like that. Young reporter says, well then, Captain Preston, it must have been that Stamp Act, that tea tax. Captain Preston says, you know what? I never bought one of those stamps. I don't know of anybody that did. And well, Sam Adams and the boys, they took care of that tea when they threw it into the Boston Harbor. No, it wasn't anything like that. Frustrated now, the young reporter says, Captain Preston, what was it? Captain Preston becomes serious. He looks at the young man and he says, well, you see, son, we had always been a free people. We were a free people. And those redcoats intended we no longer be free. Today, it is those Marxist progressives who intend that we no longer be free. Today, it is those Marxist progressives who tell us that that capitalistic system that built this country into the greatest economic engine the world has ever seen, that capitalistic system is evil. That capitalistic system causes all poverty. Why, it's that capitalistic system that limits opportunity, brings about inequality. They tell us that capitalistic system must be abolished and it must be replaced by a fair and a just, classless society that is totally equal, that is totally conforming, and that is ruled by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Today, we are a less free people than we were on March 20th of 1775. We find March 20th of 1775, the General Assembly of Virginia is meeting in Richmond. They're meeting in a church. One of the representatives arises to rebut another representative that has just said, we must be more tolerant with the British. He has just said, we must be more patient with the British. We must give them more time. Well, we must be more reasonable with the British. And Patrick Henry, after an eloquent rebuttal, have this stirring call for action, and I want to quote Patrick Henry when he said, "Is life so sweet? Is peace so dear? As to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." To paraphrase Captain Preston Levy, we were a free people. We are a less free people today, and those Marxist progressives intend that we no longer be a free people. My call to action to you today is I beg you to join me in my efforts to interest, to inform, and to involve all freedom-loving Americans so we can bequeath to our children and our grandchildren that capitalist system of unlimited opportunity, that freedom that those colonists, our founders, bequeathed to us. And in closing, I want to echo the proclamation of our children and our grandchildren for that priceless gift to them when they say, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And thank you so much for your attention.
You're listening to Awake Radio. Straight talk for the awake and aware.